When Frank Miller stepped out onto his porch in Wisconsin, he swore the wind still smelled of gunpowder, even after 40 years. He'd tell himself the war was over, but his body knew better. Somewhere deep inside, the jungle still breathed. To his neighbors, Frank was just another quiet old man in a denim jacket who fed the birds every morning. To the kids on the block, he was that weird guy who hated fireworks and slammed doors. They didn't know every loud sound for him was still a gunshot. He'd fought in Vietnam, Bravo Company, 1971. He came home, got married, worked the factory line, and tried to forget. But forgetting is never a choice. It's a wound that never scabs over. His wife, Mary, never pressed him. She just stayed close when he woke screaming at 2 a.m., shaking, whispering a name he could never finish. When she died of cancer, Frank didn't cry. He just sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the empty pillow, and whispered, "Now it's really quiet." Days blurred. He fixed cars in his garage, changed oil, replaced belts. The kind of work where bolts listened better than people. At night, he turned on an old radio and listened to static. He said it calmed him. But in that static, he sometimes heard voices. Voices he'd buried with time. One night, rummaging through a metal ammo box, he found a cassette labeled Bravo Unit, March 1971. He didn't remember recording it. Did one of the guys carry a field recorder? Maybe. Maybe not, but something inside him whispered, "Play it." He plugged in an ancient tape deck, pressed play. First came the hiss, then laughter, young, reckless, alive. Tommy's voice shouting over the rotor wash, then gunfire, screams, static, and a single order. "Frank, go! I'll cover you!" His breath caught. That day, that mission, that moment he ran, and Tommy didn't. He hit pause. His hands trembled. For decades, he'd locked that memory away. Now, it was loose again. The jungle, the rain, the smell of fear. He could almost feel the mud on his boots. He sat there, staring at the tape deck, the reels still turning even though he'd stopped it. And for the first time in 40 years, Frank whispered out loud, "I left you there, and you never left me." The next morning, Frank drove his rusted Chevy pickup down Highway 29 toward the local veterans post. It wasn't a place he visited often. Too many memories, too many ghosts wearing name tags. But something about that tape wouldn't let him sit still. Inside, the air smelled like old coffee and tobacco. A TV played a ball game no one watched. Men sat in silence. Same haunted look, different wars. Frank carried the cassette in his pocket like a live grenade. Behind the counter, a heavy-set man with gray stubble looked up. "Morning. Haven't seen you before. Name's Frank Miller, Bravo 71. The man's eyes flickered. Respect, maybe, or recognition. He extended his hand. "Carl Carson. Charlie Company, same year. You got that look. Like something followed you home." Frank pulled out the cassette, set it on the counter. "I found this last night. Says March 71, Bravo Unit. You ever heard of something like this?" Carson stared at the tape like it was a loaded weapon. "Where'd you get it?" "From my old kit box." "I didn't even know I had it." Carson hesitated. Then, "Sit down. You need to hear this." In the back office, Carson turned on an ancient reel-to-reel machine. Frank handed him the cassette, and the machine began to hum. The sound hit instantly. Gunfire, shouting, the whine of a helicopter. Then Tommy's voice again. Same phrase. "Frank, go, I'll cover you." But then came something else. A faint background voice. A whisper. Different tone. Not English, it was Vietnamese. A translator's voice, repeating radio commands. Carson froze. "That's not a regular combat record," he said quietly. "That's from an intercepted frequency." "Intercepted?" Frank frowned. "Meaning what?" meaning somebody recorded your unit's channel that day. Could have been intelligence, could have been enemy recon. Either way, that tape wasn't supposed to exist. They sat in silence for a long minute. Then Carson said, "There's a guy down in Madison. Name's Lee Porter. Used to run communications during the pullout. Knows how these tapes were routed. If anyone can tell us where this came from, it's him." Frank nodded slowly. He hadn't planned on digging deeper. But once you open the door, the war doesn't let you close it again. They drove south that weekend. 2 old men, 1 truck, 1 ghost between them. The wind howled through broken seals. The radio played classic rock with static cutting every chorus. Every mile felt like another piece of the past breaking loose. Lee Porter lived on the edge of town. A retired radio operator with more scars than stories. His house was cluttered with radios, maps, antennas, wires. Looked more like a bunker than a home. He listened to the tape in complete silence. When it stopped, he leaned back in his chair, exhaled, and said, "You boys don't realize what you're holding." "What do you mean?" Frank asked. "That tape. It's from a Black Channel intercept. They used it to monitor field transmissions from captured American units. That whisper you hear? That's not enemy chatter. That's one of ours. Someone embedded behind lines." Frank frowned. "You're saying an American recorded it?" Lee nodded. "And not just anyone. The voice, I think I know it. We called him Shadow 6. He worked translation and field recovery. Went missing the same week as your friend, Tommy Donovan." Frank's stomach dropped. He hadn't heard that name in decades, spoken out loud. "You're saying Tommy was with him?" Lee rubbed his temple. "I'm saying your buddy might not have died. And if he didn't, somebody made damn sure no one ever found out." That night, back at the motel, Frank couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, the tape player beside him, the sound of the desert wind outside. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tommy's face, the grin, the dirt, the blood. And that last second when their eyes met through the smoke, he replayed the recording one more time. Gunfire, shouting. Then, after the explosion, a voice, softer now, nearly drowned in static. "Tell Frank, I'm still here." Frank's blood went cold. He rewound, played it again. The same line, the same faint breath. He stared at the player, heart hammering. And for the first time since the war, he whispered into the dark, "All right, Tommy, I hear you." Lee Porter didn't waste breath on pep talks. He drew a map on the back of a diner receipt, underlined a street with a greasy thumb, and said, "You're looking for a door that doesn't want to be found." The building sat 3 blocks off a quiet main road in Madison. Brick. No signs, no cameras. A rusted metal door, paint peeling like old scars. If you didn't know, you'd keep walking. Lee knocked in a pattern. 3 short, 2 long. The lock clicked. Inside, shelves. Floor to ceiling. Tape boxes stacked like tombstones. Cardboard labeled in neat block letters. SIGINT, AFVN mirrors, unsorted March, 71. The air smelled like dust, oxide, and secrets. A woman in her 70s rolled toward them on a squeaky stool. "Name's Dixie," she said. "I keep what history throws away." Lee nodded. "We need the western intercepts." Central corridor, late March. Dixie tapped her pen against her teeth. Always the hard ones. Then, she slid off the stool and disappeared between stacks. Frank stood very still. He could feel it here, the hum under the skin, like a far radio that knows your frequency. Dixie returned with 2 reels and a cassette in a cracked case. On the cassette, black marker bled through tape, WX312, Unid Vox. She held it like you hold a live wire. "You sure?" Frank met her eyes. "Been sure since the jungle." They set up a battered machine on a metal cart. The reels began to turn, wobbly at first, then smooth, like memory remembering how to move. Static, distant rotor wash. A man's breath close to the microphone. Then English, flattened by training. Shadow 6 on 8. West route compromised. One American separated under fire. Marking with white flare, then switching to dark. Lee's jaw tightened. That's him. Another voice. Younger, raw, full of sand and stubborn. This is Tommy D. I have 2 minutes of cover. Tell Frank I said go. Frank's ribs clenched like a fist. He didn't blink. Gunfire cracked. Then, something new. A low, halting voice in accented English. No shoot. Bring alive. Orders west. Dixie paused the reel and scribbled time code on a yellow pad. You don't get voices like that on training tapes, she said. That's field. The reel rolled again. Paper rustled near the mic, a whisper close enough to count the breath. If you hear this, I'm still here. It wasn't the broken motel room miracle. It was clearer, sharper. Like the sentence had waited 50 years for a right room. Lee killed the volume. There's a second reel. Dixie swapped reels with a care that looked like prayer. The machine clicked. Static turned to rain. Shadow 6 moving with local. West Trail. No markers. If anyone pulls this later, log the name Thomas Donovan. Frank swallowed hard. He didn't look away. The tape ended on the hollow thump of a hand against a recorder, then silence so thick you could fold it. Dixie rewound both reels and boxed them with the sort of tenderness you save for family. You want copies or you want to know? She asked. Both, Frank said. His voice sounded older than his face. Lee scribbled a list on the back of the receipt. There's a recovery report that never went public, he said. If we can find the thin file that goes with this thick mess, we'll know if someone pulled him out or buried the trail. Dixie wheeled to a different aisle. Thin file, you said? I've got a drawer for good intentions. She yanked open a cabinet and thumbed through folders until she found a brittle manila jacket with a bent fastener. WX312, Box AUX. Inside were 3 pages, a grid with times, a typed summary, and a Polaroid washed in desert light. The summary was short. In the way only dangerous documents are short. Field note. Uncatalogued contact. Shadow 6 subject. T. Donovan, U.S. Status. Recovered to third-party handling. West Track. No ceremony. No press. Awaiting identity stabilization. Lee read it twice. Third-party handling, he muttered. That's the phrase they used when operations crossed wires. Military, intel, locals. Means, we got him. But we don't want to explain how. Frank picked up the Polaroid. 3 men, under a canvas awning. One looked down, face in shadow. One stared past the camera, chin bandaged. The third, thin, eyes burned clean, stared right through the lens. The caption at the bottom, faded but legible. West Safe House, 73. The eyes were Tommy's. Older by 2 years, but Tommy's. Frank didn't breathe for a long beat. Then he did, slow, like coming up from a deep dive. He slid the photo back into the file with both hands. Dixie watched him carefully. You want me to lock this down or make a copy set and pretend I never met you? Copy, Frank said. Then lock the rest down so tight it forgets its own name. Dixie nodded and started the digitizer. The machine whined to life, turning half a century into raw signal again. Lee touched Frank's shoulder. You were right to come. Frank shook his head. I was late. There's a difference. Lee didn't argue. Late still beats never. They drove back to the motel with a USB stick and a Polaroid wrapped in a bar napkin. On the nightstand, Frank laid the photo next to the cassette from his ammo box. Past and proof, shoulder to shoulder. Carson called from Wisconsin just before midnight. You find anything? Frank stared at the ceiling, voice barely above a whisper. "We found him." Silence traveled 1,000 miles in a breath. "Alive?" Carson asked. Frank pictured the bandaged chin, the clear eyes, the caption. "Long enough to send a message," he said. "Long enough to be counted." Carson exhaled like someone stepping off a weight. "Then the rest is ceremony." "No," Frank said. "The rest is names." The next morning, they met Lee again at a chain coffee shop that smelled like cinnamon and office chairs. He had a printout under his arm and a phone he kept face down. "I made calls last night," he said without hello. "There's a post office box in Tucson that belonged to a Thomas J. Dawes in the mid-70s. Rental records show a renewal by a federal liaison. After that, nothing." Frank's mouth went dry. Tommy's alias. He had held it in his hands 2 days earlier, on a mailbox under a desert sun. "Why a box?" Carson asked. "Because if you're building a new life that isn't supposed to have a past," Lee said, "you give the past a place to arrive where it can't find your door." Frank stared at the printout until the letters blurred. "What do we do with this?" he asked. Lee slid him an envelope. Inside, a single page, a letter template, simple and clean. "To whom it may concern, I am writing to update the record of Thomas Donovan, formerly listed as missing in action. Evidence enclosed suggests field recovery and subsequent re-identification under alternate credentials. This submission seeks to correct status and initiate contact with any surviving kin willing to update memorial data and funeral honors." At the bottom, a line for a signature. "Paper is slow," Lee said, "but paper is permanent. You start a trail that bureaucracy can't quietly eat." Frank ran a thumb along the edge. The paper didn't tremble. His hand didn't either. "Who gets this?" he asked. "Defense POW, MIA accounting agency," Lee said. "And the county registrar where his family last filed anything. 2 copies. Send them certified." "Make noise without shouting." Frank nodded once. "And the tape?" Lee smiled a tired smile. "Donate a copy to a museum that knows the difference between display and theater. Let the living hear what the dead left behind." They drove home, following 2 lanes of asphalt that looked like a zipper through farmland. Frank didn't speak for miles. When he did, his voice had a new gravity to it, like a tool that had finally found its job. "I carried a question for half a century," he said. "Turns out it was a message." "What message?" Carson asked. "Simple," Frank said. "Go, and don't come back alone." Carson looked out the window at empty fields and nodded. "We're not alone now." Back in Wisconsin, the world hadn't changed, but Frank had. He cleaned the garage like a man preparing a room for guests. He oiled wrenches, labeled jars of bolts, swept the floor twice. Rituals matter when your hands need something to hold besides old ghosts. That evening, he dialed a number he hadn't used in years, the Donovan family's last listed line. A recorded voice answered, "Disconnected." He hung up, sat very still, then opened a drawer and pulled out a blank card. He wrote 2 sentences. "I served with your son. I have something that belongs to him." He signed his name and stared at the ink until it dried. The museum in Milwaukee gave them a small room with a glass window and a table that didn't wobble. The curator, Mrs. Brown, listened without interrupting. When Frank finished, she said only, "We'll do this right." They set a date for a private listening. Veterans only, families welcome. No press, no speeches longer than the tape. When the day came, the room filled slowly, men with canes. Women with folded hands, sons and daughters with faces that had learned how to be strong in quiet ways. Frank stood by the machine like a witness. He did not introduce himself. He pressed play. The room became a time machine. The whir of a rotor, the snap of branches, a prayer that never learned church. Tommy's voice was young again. "Frank, go, I'll cover you." A hand brushed away a tear 4 chairs down. Mrs. Brown's jaw set. Carson sat straighter, eyes fixed on nothing. Then the line only a few would ever believe if it hadn't been captured in oxide. "If you hear this, I'm still here." Someone in the back whispered, "He was. He was." Frank didn't cry. He let the words pass through him like rain through wire. When the reel ended, he stopped the machine and stepped aside. Mrs. Brown spoke softly. "We are adding this to a permanent exhibit. Not as spectacle, as evidence that voices cross time when we give them a room." A woman in her 70s approached with a photograph. "My brother went missing the same year," she said, voice steady. "We never got to hear anything. Thank you for letting us borrow a voice." Frank took the photo. A young man smiled from a world still convinced the future was simple. Frank nodded and placed the photo by the machine for the second playback. "He can stand watch with us," he said. After the listening, Frank walked out into the cold and stood by the river. The water moved like an old story, slow, persistent, not caring who believed it. Carson joined him. "You ready for the last part?" he asked. "What's the last part?" "Writing it down," Carson said. "So the government file has to learn our names." Frank looked at the sky. Flat, gray, honest. "Yeah," he said. "Let's teach the file." They spent that night at Frank's kitchen table. Coffee went cold and got replaced. Pens ran dry and got tossed in a jar. They wrote the letter twice, once for the agency, once for the county. Lee emailed back with corrections. Remove adjectives, add dates, attach the printouts, include the Polaroid scan, cite the real numbers like you mean it. They mailed the packets, certified at 10 the next morning. The clerk stamped the receipts with a sound that felt like a small, official heartbeat. Now it was out of their hands, and finally in the only hands that could tie the knot. Back home, Frank sat with the tape on his lap. He could have pressed play again. He didn't. Not tonight. He'd learned the difference between honoring memory and feeding it. The phone rang at dusk. Unknown number. He answered anyway. A man's voice, dry, professional, but careful in a way that said he understood what voices weighed. "Mr. Miller, this is the county registrar's office. We received your packet. We reviewed the materials. I wanted to call you before the letter catches up." Frank braced. "Yes. We will open a status review for Thomas Donovan," the man said. "It won't be quick, but it will be clean. And Mr. Miller, thank you for doing the part we forgot." After the call, Frank stood at the sink and watched sunlight leave the window like a quiet friend. He set the receiver down and exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding since the jungle. For the first time in a lifetime, the house didn't feel like a bunker. It felt like a porch, a place you leave and return to by choice. He opened the back door and let the evening in. It smelled like cut grass, cold metal, and rain that had changed its mind. He said it out loud, to the yard, to the tape, to the kid he used to be, and the man who covered him while he ran. Message received. 3 months later, the letter came back. Not with rejection, with acknowledgement. A short paragraph stamped, "Status update, under review." It was the government's way of saying, "We finally heard you." Frank read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it inside the ammo box with the cassette. Then he closed the lid and whispered, "Welcome home, Tommy." The ceremony wasn't public. No cameras, no speeches, no folded flags. Just a handful of men who'd learned the hard way that closure never comes in headlines. It was held in a park by the river, the same place where the new Echoes of Service exhibit now stood. Carson spoke first. His voice cracked but never broke. "We waited a lifetime for a sign," he said. Turns out it was sitting in Frank's garage the whole damn time. Laughter. The kind that comes from old wounds that finally stopped bleeding. Mrs. Brown from the museum placed the Polaroid inside a glass frame next to Tommy's dog tag. Visitors walked by, some in silence, some with tears, some whispering thank yous they wished they'd said decades earlier. Frank stood back, hands in his pockets. He didn't need to say anything. The story was already speaking, through the hum of the tape player looping softly in the background, through the names etched on the exhibit wall, through the wind that carried the faint smell of rain and dust. Later that evening, he sat alone on his porch, staring at the horizon. The sunset bled across the sky. Orange, red, fading into gray. The kind of colors that don't need to shout to be remembered. He poured 2 cups of coffee, set one beside the empty chair and said, "Still hot. Just how you liked it." The wind rustled the trees. Somewhere down the block, kids lit a firecracker. For the first time in 40 years, Frank didn't flinch. He smiled. "Not today," he said softly. "Today we made peace." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, a note Tommy had written years ago, found among the reels. "If you're hearing this, we did it." We outlived the silence. Frank folded it carefully, tucked it into his wallet, and looked up at the darkening sky. "Yeah," he whispered, "we sure did." The next morning, a letter arrived addressed to Mr. F. Miller, Bravo Company. Inside was a simple statement. Reclassification approved. Sergeant Thomas Donovan, confirmed repatriated, deceased 1976. Official record updated. Frank traced the words with his thumb. "Repatriated," he murmured. Then, almost smiling, "Took you long enough?" He placed the letter next to the coffee cup, turned on the radio, and tuned through the static until he found the same hiss that used to haunt him. But this time, it wasn't noise. It was presence. It was the sound of a life that mattered. Twice. Weeks later, the exhibit grew. Visitors started leaving letters under the glass. Sons, daughters, grandkids. Words like, "I never knew my dad was there," or, "Thank you for proving they weren't forgotten." Frank went back once, quietly. He didn't announce himself. He just stood there, reading the notes, letting their voices mix with his own memory. A young volunteer noticed him and asked, "Were you part of it?" Frank looked at the photos, the names, the cassette still turning in its loop. He nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I was part of it. Still am." The kid smiled. "Must feel good to have it finished." Frank thought for a moment, then shook his head gently. "No," he said. "It feels good to finally know it never really ends." When he left the museum, the city was quiet. Sunday stillness. The kind you only notice when you stop running from it. He walked along the river, same path he'd taken years ago when the nightmares owned him. Now, every sound, the rippling water, the distant train horn, the crunch of gravel, felt like proof of life. He reached the bridge and stopped halfway across. The sun was low, golden, reflecting off the current like an old metal catching light. He took the folded letter from his pocket, held it over the rail, and let the wind take it. The paper fluttered once, twice, then vanished downstream, toward somewhere freer than records or walls. "Go on," Frank said. "You've earned it." That night, the wind returned, soft, almost musical, brushing the porch steps like it knew the rhythm of the story. He closed his eyes. And somewhere between memory and dream, between duty and peace, he heard a voice, faint but certain. "We're home, Frank." He smiled, leaned back and let the quiet hold him.